If you've been following this podcast, especially just the past few episodes, you'll get a sense that things were going downhill pretty quickly for the Romans, especially if we focus on the types of people who were ruling the empire. Emperors like Elagabalus, a teenager who worshipped a black rock from Syria and who engaged in all kinds of debauchery, or prior to him, Macrinus, who apparently assassinated his predecessor, Caracalla. And Caracalla, he murdered his own citizens as well as his own brother. He did serious damage to the Roman economy. So the past three emperors have not been very impressive. But as we'll see today, when he took over in AD 222, Alexander was not even a teenager, and Rome's youngest emperors thus far have been some of its worst. But unlike those emperors, Alexander was carefully guarded. And although Alexander wouldn't be the last decent Roman emperor, he would be the last one for a good long while. So let's talk about the reign of Alexander Severus on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 70, The End of the Severan Dynasty. Folks, before we get started, I wanted to mention a lecture that I'll be giving soon that's available to anybody. Smithsonian Associates in Washington, D.C. are hosting me for a virtual talk called After Caesar, The Last Years of the Roman Republic. This talk's going to be on Tuesday, February 11th of 2025. We're going to get started at 6:45 p.m., and the talk plus the Q&A will go for about an hour and a half. Now, that is a ticketed event, so you will need to get a ticket through Smithsonian Associates, but this will be the third time that I've delivered a lecture for them. It's a great evening. They put together a fantastic program, and I certainly have a lot of fun doing it, especially the Q&A portion. So if you're interested in that, just go to the Smithsonian Associates website, look up my name or look up the name of the talk, After Caesar, The Last Years of the Roman Republic, and then catch the talk on February the 11th. I'll also mention that if you want some free lecture content with video rather than just the podcast, you can check out my YouTube channel. I've decided to start a series on Rome before it was Rome. That is, the Rome of the archaic past, Rome during the time of its kings, even before the Roman Republic. It's a 6-part video series. The lectures are about 30 minutes each, and those are being posted to my new YouTube channel. You can find that by looking up my name on YouTube. You can also just use my YouTube username, which is ProfCPE, PROFCPE, and you can get access to those videos for free. My hope is to generate enough interest in the YouTube channel that it can be a viable outlet for some of the ancient history I do. So if you haven't subscribed to that channel and you're interested, you can head on over to YouTube and do that. And of course, if you enjoy this podcast and you haven't yet done so, it'd be awesome if you left a review or a comment just saying that you appreciate the podcast. You can also leave a rating with Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever it is you use to listen to the podcast. All of those just help boost the channel. And thanks, of course, for listening to the podcast. Let's get to today's episode. So as I said in the introduction, Alexander Severus takes over in 222 AD at the ripe old age of 11. His full name is Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander. And of course, we see here something that we have seen with numerous Severan emperors. They have no relation whatsoever to Marcus Aurelius and the good emperors of the last century of the Pax Romana, but they just decided to appropriate those names anyway. And here Alexander Severus is called Marcus Aurelius as a way to suggest that the good old days of the Pax Romana are continuing. But if you followed this podcast, you know that that's really not the case at all. This is a complete lie, that actually things are going south. Now, in the case of Alexander Severus, his mother and his grandmother are able to step in and guide the empire through what is a very difficult decade and a half. And Alexander Severus seems to have avoided some of the pitfalls of other young emperors like Caligula and Nero and Commodus. And I think it helps that his mother and grandmother did not try to run the show alone. When Alexander Severus took over, these two women put 16 senators, senior men, well experienced from the Roman Senate, and this number likely included Cassius Dio, as advisors to not only help Alexander with policy, but to educate him so that when he reached manhood, he would be able to take over. The Greek historian Herodian, he was not in the Senate or even in Rome when he wrote, but Herodian's perspective out in the provinces is positive. This is what Herodian said about Alexander Severus and the women around him. Quote, "When Alexander received the empire, the appearance and the title of emperor were allowed him, but the management and control of imperial affairs were in the hands of his women, and they undertook a more moderate and more equitable administration. First, they chose from the Senate to be the emperor's advisory council 16 men who, because of their age, seemed most dignified and temperate in their conduct. Nothing was said or done unless these men had first considered the matter and given unanimous approval. The fact that the character of the imperial government was changed from an arrogant autocracy to the form of aristocracy pleased the people, the army, and especially the senators." So we see in Herodian a little bit more detail about the senators who were in charge, and also what he characterizes as a positive reception of a more aristocratic turn in the Roman government. Herodian, however, is almost certainly mistaken. It is very likely, in fact, that the soldiers were not happy with an aristocratic turn. After all, those soldiers did a lot better financially when emperors looted and pillaged members of the Senate, stealing their property so that they could mint coins to give hefty pay rises to the soldiers. Alexander Severus evidently was not this sort of emperor, and I'm sure that the soldiers were aware of this and were not particularly happy about it. As to the people, who knows whether they were happier or not. If anything, at this time, they probably just wanted a little bit of stability, and Alexander Severus certainly provided that, and so maybe indeed the people were content. Herodian, of course, was almost certainly correct that the senators were happy. Cassius Dio's account verifies this exact point. He thought Alexander Severus a particularly good emperor and was very pleased to serve under him. Cassius Dio said this of when Alexander took over, quote, "When the false Antoninus had been put out of the way, Alexander, the son of Mamaea and his cousin, inherited the supreme power. He immediately proclaimed his mother Augusta, and she took over the direction of affairs and gathered wise men about her son in order that his habits might be correctly formed by them. She also chose the best men in the Senate as advisors, informing them of all that had to be done." That's Cassius Dio's Roman history. Now, of course, Cassius Dio is probably one of those senators, so in speaking about how great these men are, he's also speaking about how great he was. Cassius Dio, by the way, would neither be the first nor the last Roman senator to be a little bit full of himself. And senators featured prominently in Alexander Severus's administration. This would be the first time that this happened in decades. And as a result, we see portrayals like this one in Cassius Dio, which is shockingly positive with regard to these women. Julia Misa, the grandmother, and Julia Mamaea, the mother, are not portrayed negatively as like conniving, overbearing women in the way that, say, Agrippina was. These are women that recognized their roles, but ultimately deferred to the Senate in order to ensure that Alexander was adequately prepared. Now, midway through Alexander's reign, which would last from AD 222 until 235, his grandmother, Julia Misa, died, and her grandson deified her in honor of the role that she played, not only in educating him and advising him, but in putting him to power in the first place. Of course, we shouldn't forget that Alexander came into power through a pretty atrocious coup instigated by his grandmother. We don't want to pretend that she was an entirely virtuous woman, but she was clearly politically very savvy, and Alexander would miss her presence. One of the reasons that Cassius Dio and Herodian and other elites in this period were pleased with the women in Alexander Severus's life was that they not only deferred to the Senate in matters of politics and government and education, but they did not take a permissive hand in terms of the character of Alexander. This is Herodian, for example, on Alexander's mother, Julia Mamaea. Quote, "She kept the palace under close guard and allowed no one suspected of debauchery to approach the young man. She was afraid that his character would be corrupted if his flatterers aroused his growing appetites to disgraceful desires. She therefore induced him to serve as judge in the courts continually, and for most of each day. Occupied with important matters and the necessary business of the empire, he would have no opportunity to indulge in scandalous practices. Alexander's deportment was governed by a character naturally mild and civilized and much inclined to benevolence, as was made clear when the youth grew older. And indeed, Alexander would grow up to be a far less grandiose and megalomaniacal emperor than several of his predecessors. A biography of Alexander written a few centuries after his death says this, quote, "He forbade men to call him Lord and gave orders that people should write to him as they would to a commoner, retaining only the title Imperator. He removed from the imperial footwear and garments all the jewels that had been used by Elagabalus. In appointing consuls, either regular or substitute, he always asked for the opinion of the Senate." That's the Augustan History, Life of Alexander. Alexander does seem to have had a particular interest in the Roman court system and legal matters more generally. We know from records of laws that were compiled in later centuries that the reign of Alexander Severus was an important time for lawmaking and argumentation. Many key legal texts were written during this period, and some of the most famous Roman jurists were at the height of their careers during his reign. Alexander was a natural negotiator, it sounds like, or at least he knew how to put men into positions who were effective negotiators. For example, over in Persia, a major transition had recently occurred with the Parthian Empire ending, and a new dynasty called the Sasanian dynasty was rapidly taking over not only Persia, but expanding into Roman territory. Mesopotamia, in particular, had been a region that had swapped hands between the Parthians and the Romans, and the Sasanians, now in charge of Persia, wanted to make that territory theirs. In 232 AD, Alexander led a large army towards the east, but he really didn't feel the need to fight a war. The whole point of the expedition was to show the new king of Persia, Ardashir I, that the Roman Empire was going to hold its borders through force if necessary, and so it would be a good idea for the new Sasanian regime and the new emperor Alexander to reach an agreement before any kind of war ever broke out. The tactic worked, and Ardashir sought a formal cessation of any hostilities between the two empires and a secure treaty to preserve the peace. The Persians agreed not to advance into Roman territory, and so without spilling much Roman blood at all, there were just a few skirmishes ahead of the negotiations. Alexander secured one of the two major borders that the Roman Empire had to deal with. It was an excellent foreign policy maneuver. Of course, the Roman soldiers, who were not pro-peace, but desired wars for purposes of plunder and profit, were unhappy with Severus Alexander. The soldiers particularly enjoyed the diversions of the Eastern Empire. Cassius Dio reports that, quote, "Our armies are in such a state that some of the troops are actually joining the Persians, and others are refusing to defend themselves. They indulge in such wantonness, license, and lack of discipline that those in Mesopotamia even dared kill their commander." That's Cassius Dio's Roman history. So the soldiers wanted loot and license, and Alexander was not giving them the opportunity. In fact, Herodian says that whispers of regime change began to circulate in the Roman armies. Quote, "The soldiers considered the current reign burdensome because of its long duration. They plotted now to kill Alexander and proclaim Maximinus emperor and Augustus, since he was their fellow soldier and messmate, and seemed, because of his experience and courage, to be the right man to take charge of the present war." That's Herodian's account. So what is the present war that Herodian refers to? Well, just after Alexander secured a peace on Rome's eastern border, conflict erupted on Rome's northern border. We haven't talked about the northern border in a while because all the way back during the reign of Commodus, that emperor secured a lasting peace. Prior to Commodus, Marcus Aurelius had been dealing with almost 2 decades of incursions, invasions, and even the sacking of Italian cities by Germanic peoples crossing the Danube River. Commodus's peace protected that border. But now in 234 AD, a new onslaught of invasions began across the Danube, and Alexander rushed to the border along with his mother, Julia Mamaea. When he made it to the German border in 234, Alexander attempted diplomacy as well, bringing troops as a show of force, but hoping he didn't have to use them. He offered several of the German tribes payments in silver and gold, and maybe even some rights to Roman land in the hopes of securing a long-term peace. The army, however, was unhappy with this strategy. They wanted to fight. And in 235, Alexander's army revolted. Soldiers surrounded Alexander's tent, and he and his mother were helpless as the emperor's own soldiers cut down both emperor and mother, ending both the reign of Alexander Severus and the dynasty of the Severans. Roman history now entered an age called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, a period in which the average reign of each emperor would last less than 2 years, and for virtually the entire period, there would be more than one claimant to the throne. Foreign incursions ramped up, and at the same time, the Roman army was busy fighting civil wars. The economy suffered the worst episodes of Roman currency debasement that the ancient Mediterranean as a whole had ever seen. It was a tumultuous time. Although his emperor was dead, Cassius Dio remained alive. And in his History of the Roman Empire, he leaves behind advice for the Romans, a program of reforms that he believed could save the empire. And so before we get into the dark events of the 3rd century AD, we'll turn to Cassius Dio's final words for the Roman Empire as a contrast to how things were, a path that Rome might have taken but didn't. Would it have saved the Roman Empire? We'll answer that question on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.